Hello and welcome to the 10th tutorial in the series, and today we're gonna go through a couple of new things. First of all, I'm going to create a background to the image and create a different lighting to the scene, because the way we created the lighting before using the V-Ray Sun and V-Ray Sky is a good way, but I prefer another way and I want to show it to you, which is HDRI image lighting. So we'll do that, then we'll add fences here and some trees in the background. I'll show you a couple of websites I like to go to get free models for my projects, and also sky pictures and things like that. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the lighting in my scene. So the lighting in the scene was, the end result was like so. Keep in mind there are no trees in the background yet, and there are no skies and things like that. So the way of using V-Ray Sun and Sky is a good way, but I prefer using HDR image background and global illumination. So in order to do that, I'm going to delete the V-Ray Sun. I'm going to go to rendering environment and I'm going to delete the V-Ray Sky also. And now I'm going to add an HDRI image to my scene here. In order to get an HDRI image, you know what, first of all I'm going to take the camera just a bit down because it's too high. So if I create a box and see how high the camera is from the ground, I am almost 3 meters in the air. So I want to take the camera just a bit down. So I'm looking from a human viewport, human view. So 177 is a little bit high, but that's fine. I'm going to go back to camera, and this view looks much better. So it was like Control Z to go back, was like this, and now it's like this. So I think it's a better mood for the image to capture it from this view. Okay, so now I want to find an HDRI image. What is an HDRI image? It's an image that was captured using special cameras that capture larger color numbers. So if a regular image has 255 values of red, green and blue, the HDRI image has lots more than 255. So the lighting in the scene will look better. In order to find these images, you can just Google it. You can go to Google and Google HDRI images or HDRI sky. And there are a lot of samples and free samples of HDRI images and skies and maps and things like that. But I found a couple of sites that I like with HDRI images, and they are free. So the first site, all the sites were going to be in the description below. So the first site I found is Viz People, and you have free trees models here and free things for kitchen visualizations and things like that. But what we are interested in right now is this free HDRI maps updates. So let's go inside here. You need to register to the site. It takes 1 minute and it's free, so don't worry about that. After you are registered, you can download the HDRI. I already downloaded it. So what I'm going to do is, when you download this pack, it comes as a zip file. So this is the zip file. Where are we? HDRI, this one. I'm going to extract it to my project's directory. And the reason I'm doing this, you need to extract it to the same directory the max file is in. The reason for this is, when you use this map, Max will not have to search for it all over your hard drive. So you can just see it inside the directory the file is in. Let's go back. Download, 1 second. Oh, here it is. Okay, I'm going to extract it to my library, to my directory. We have a couple of skies here. Let's go inside and check this out. Catalog. You have a number of visualizations with a number of skies for your choosing. So you can choose an HDRI sky for night, or for clear day sky, or cloudy. You have a lot of maps here and they're all free. So what we're going to do in order to implement this method, I'm going to go to I'm going to create a V-Ray light. Going to lights, V-Ray light, and I'm going to change this type from plane to dome. Now when you create a dome light, it essentially means that this light is the sky of the entire image. So no matter what colors you put in here, they will reflect as the sky of the image. So let's go back to camera using the C button, and let's disable it for a second and check there are no lights in the scene. So I'm going to go to environment. We have a black environment with no lights inside. So if I render now, the rendering is supposed to be pure black, which it is, because it doesn't receive lights from anywhere. Now I'm going to add this V-Ray dome light. So we build the dome. Let's click on back. And in here I'm going to use a texture. So I'm going to click on none. And I'm going to go to maps, V-Ray, and use this texture, V-Ray HDRI. Now let's drag this texture to our material editor, to an empty slot instance. Now it's very important to make an instance, because if you create a copy, the changes you're going to make here won't affect this slot here. Instance is a clone, so everything that you do here will affect this one also. So I'm going to create an instance of it. In the bitmap, I'm going to import the map I want. So let's go to the HDRI library that I extracted from the zip file. Go to HDR file, and now you can see there are a lot of skies here. You can see the sky in this preview on the right. So let's search for a sky that is suitable for us. We want a sky, a clear sky, but not too clear, with a little bit of clouds, for a day scene. So this one, the number 5, is the best in my opinion for this thing. So I'm going to open it. And now as you can see, if I double click it, you can see we have an environment here. We have a grass down here and a sky down up here. But it's a little bit distorted. Something is strange with this image. And that's because we're using the mapping type as 3D Max standard, which is just a map in the front. We need to use this HDRI map as it was intended. We're going to use it as a spherical environment. So now when you go inside, you can see that it's not distorted, and you can move the environment using the horizontal rotation and vertical rotation. So I can rotate the image and look in every direction I want. When you rotate the image, the sun will fall from different direction on the building. So let's get this back to 0. So what this mapping type does is it maps the HDRI image as it was intended when the image was taken. So sometimes it's a spherical HDRI image, sometimes it's a mirror ball, cubical, angular. This time it's spherical. What I usually do is I just check every one of these options until I get a good result here that is not distorted. So the spherical is my first option. It's usually spherical. Okay, so now we did that. Now let's try rendering. It's very, very dark. Okay, and that's because we need to up the value of the multiplier. So we need to up the intensity. Let's up this to 30. Okay, this looks much better. And as you can see, the sun is coming from this direction because there is like shadow here from the building. Now, in order to see the result, I'm not going to hit render all the time because it takes a lot of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use V-Ray real time, V-Ray RT. In order to apply this, I'm going to go to render setup, go to renderer, and I'm going to change this to V-Ray RT. So now when I hit render, just allow this, it renders much faster. It's very splotchy and the image is not correct, but you can see the direction which the image is going. So this is good for us. You can see the brightness and you can see where the shadow is falling. So you can align the image correctly using the V-Ray RT and then go back to just a regular V-Ray and render it out. So first thing I see is the shadow is falling this direction. I want it to fall something like this. So in order to change that, every change I make here, one second, let's cancel this. Every change I make here will apply to this rendering. So let's go to our material editor and just rotate the map. So let's rotate it like 90 degrees. So now the sun comes for a different direction in the scene. Let's try rendering. Alright, as you can see, the shadow falls from a different direction. The sun comes from this direction now. It's because I rotated the HDRI image. So just rotate it until you get the result you want. The result most suitable for this scene, in my opinion, is I just made a couple of checks before I filmed this video. So it was rotation of 225. So now if I render, you can see that the sun falls from these lines here on the building itself, and it shines, so the shadow falls on this side, which is the best in my opinion for this rendering, but just make it look as good as you want. Alright, so this is fine. Lighting is good. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to add a V-Ray plane to the scene. What this does is very simple. When you have lighting coming from above, as I explained in the previous tutorial, the global illumination helps it to look real, because when light comes in direct contact with something, it bounces back 90 degrees to the surface that is near it. So there is no total black in nature. It's always sun reflects from something and loses energy, so it's darker, but it hits the wall, and even in dark areas it's not completely black. So in order for the bounces to bounce correctly, I need a surface that will go in every direction forever. So I need a surface underneath this building, and when light bounces, it will bounce back, because if in these areas like here and here, there is nothing, there is no grass and nothing here. So when light hits this area, it doesn't hit, it just continues down. So we don't have bounces back to the building. So in order to fix this, I'm going to go to Geometry, V-Ray, and create a V-Ray plane. It doesn't matter where you put the plane in the scene, because this plane essentially is endless to every direction. So I can put it here, and the plane will continue endlessly to this direction and to this direction and everywhere. So I'm going to put it here in the center because it's easier to get to, like this. Now I'm going to give it a color which is neutral. So let's call this V-Ray plane, and the most neutral color is gray. So let's change this from standard to V-Ray, V-Ray material, and assign material to selected. Now this V-Ray plane is gray. Now let's go to the front viewport and place it underneath everything. So now it's exactly at the bottom of the building here, which is good. So it needs to be underneath everything. So if you have a building here, it needs to be underneath the building, because if you put it in the center of the building, you will have, let's try rendering it. If I put it here, in this height, and I render, you see, it covers the grass because it's taller than the grass and half of the building. So in order for this endless plane not to kind of cover anything, it needs to be underneath everything. So let's take it down here, and now the light will bounce correctly back from the V-Ray plane. Alright, now if I render this image, you can see that the lighting is good. We have a lighting here that shines in the right direction. You have shadow on this side, which is good, but the reflections are very dark in the windows and in this glass. In order for the reflection to be stronger, I need to up the intensity of my HDRI image. So now it's on 30. The intensity is on 30. And it shines correctly, and the brightness of the image is fine. But I want different brightness for the reflections only, because the reflections need to be stronger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift drag this V-Ray dome here. It doesn't matter where you put the dome. It's like the V-Ray plane. Everywhere in the scene you have a endless dome of the sky, so you can put it anywhere you want. I'm just putting it here because it's easier for me to get to when I click on it. So first thing is I'm going to go to the first dome, and I'm going to call it V-Ray Sky, and GI. So this is the V-Ray Sky global illumination, the bouncing of the light. So I'm going to go to options in this V-Ray dome, and I'm going to deselect specular, effect specular, and effect reflection. What this does is this sky doesn't affect any of the reflections in the scene, and it doesn't affect any of the specular, which is another kind of reflection in the scene. It only reflects the diffusion, which is the global illumination. Now I copied this V-Ray dome to here, and in this dome I'm going to go to the options and deselect the diffuse, which means this V-Ray dome will affect only specular and reflection. So we have one dome that affects only the diffuse, and one dome that affects only the specular and reflection. Now I'm going to create it invisible, because we already have a visible sky from this V-Ray dome. So don't forget to make it invisible. And now I can give it a very high value so that only the reflection will be higher value. And the global illumination, the bouncing, will still be on 30, like here. So I'm going to go to the, I'm going to call it V-Ray Sky reflection. So now this one is for reflections and this one is for GI, global illumination. Now I'm going to up this to 200. Let's try rendering. As you can see, the reflections are much stronger now. You can see the sky in the background and a couple of other things. Alright, so now this is good, maybe just a little bit less. It's just too strong. Let's make it 120. This is fine. Another thing I want to do is I want to go back to the material, the glass material, which we created a couple of tutorials ago, and I want to make it less refraction. As you remember, refraction is the transparency of an object. Now it's 100% refractive, which means it's 100% transparent. I want to make it less transparent, so 175, 76, it's fine. And I want to change the color to black, not bluish like so, but a black glass. Almost pure black, 5 or 7. 5 is good, 3. So now we have a glass which is more closed off, like real glass in balconies, because the glass in balconies is not really that transparent, it's half transparent. So let's try rendering it now. And now you would see the reflections much better, because it's more closed. The glass is more closed, the refraction is less, so the reflection is more prominent in the glass itself. Okay, this is fine, you have good reflections here. Another thing, I think the grass is just a little bit too bright, so I'm going to make it darker. And also I want to make the image, the global illumination, the bouncing, and the illumination itself, I want to make a little bit brighter, so 45 is good. The reflection is still on 120. and let's go to the grass material here and go into the diffuse slot and go to output, and RGB level is the brightness of our texture, so I'm going to make it 0.75, so now it's darker. Let's try rendering it now. Now the image is brighter. You can see that the sky is brighter and looks good with the clouds, and our grass is better, I think. Alright, so now we're done with the V-Ray plane, V-Ray sky and the reflections. We're going to build a fence on the side here, so we don't see this V-Ray plane in the background, and we're going to build just a little bit of the front of the house so we can see something here in the background and not just a gray area. And then we're going to add a couple of trees at the back so it will look better. So let's do that. First thing, I want to create a fence for the perimeter. So let's go to the top viewport. I'm going to unhide all, which means I'm going to unhide this plan, which I used to create the building. And as you can see in the plan, this is the fence here of the building. So I'm going to create this fence using a line. I'm going to go to shapes, line, one click, hold shift in order for it to go 90 degrees. Second line, and here, then holding shift again, I'm going to close the fence here. Okay, now we have only a line. Let's take this line up. Now in order to transform this line into a fence, I'm going to go to modify, to rendering, enable in renderer and enable in viewport. So now, as you can see, it has thickness, but it's circular, radial. If you make the thickness bigger, it will be thicker. But what we need is a square. So I'm going to go to rectangular. I'm going to give it a width of 20 because the fence is 20 centimeters wide. And I'm going to make it height or length 2 meters. So now we have a fence, 2-meter high fence. I'm going to take this down here so it only barely goes beneath the grass. As you can see here, just a little bit beneath, just a little bit higher like this. And let's go back to camera. Now we have a problem, because in reality the fence is very close to the house and our camera is further back away. So now what we're going to do is cheat a little bit. We're going to move the fence back and to the right. So this is fine. This is usually what we do, because when a contractor shows a 3D visualization, he always writes that this is for visualization purposes only. So it doesn't need to be 100% accurate to the truth. It just needs to sell and look good, and it has to be clarified as not 100% real. So it needs to be almost real, but you can make these little cheats like this. Just move the fence back here. Let's go to camera. Okay, so the back of the fence is back here, and let's move this side of the fence to here, so it goes with the grass. So now it's in front of my face, so let's move it back more, like so, and move it to the right more, like so. Alright. So it's outside of the frame, just move it a little bit back, so it's almost inside the frame. It's back. This is for the bouncing of light, so it needs to be almost inside the frame. 1 second. No, no good. Let's move it back, like so. More. Okay, this is good. Now let's make the grass a little bit bigger. Just move this into the front a little bit until it is visible in the camera. You can see that the camera is here and the fence is here, so we can move it until it's almost in the camera's view. So this is good. Now let's make this grass plane a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go back to editable poly, choose vertices, and move these two vertices back here. Move these ones here. Alright. So now we have a fence which is much bigger than in reality, but it's fine. So the light will bounce from the fence and create a more realistic effect in the grass here. And let's go back to the camera. Let's give this fence a texture. So I want to find a proper texture for this fence. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the site we used a couple of times in the previous tutorial, which is it's going to be in the descriptions below, but it's called CG Textures. They have a lot of free textures here. And here I'm going to go to bricks and rounded and find something that looks good for our fence. I think maybe one of these two looks good. Maybe this one. Yeah, this one looks not bad at all. I'm going to download the 1600 over 164, which is a good resolution. It doesn't need to be very, very high because we're not going to render a very, very high resolution image. But in the case you are going to render a very, very high resolution image, you need to download the biggest texture you can. So this one is the biggest. You have this sometimes even bigger than this one, but for our purposes this one is good. I'm going to click on it and download it. If it doesn't download, you need to register yourself to the site, which is free and very, very fast. So no problem there. Now I'm going to go to the library which I download this texture to, and I'm going to take this texture and copy or cut it to my project folder. This is very important because all the textures need to be with the Max file so that 3D Studio Max can find the textures. So now we're going to create a new material for this fence. Let's call it fence. And change this from standard to V-Ray to materials, V-Ray material. I'm going to go to the diffuse, click on this square here and choose standard bitmap, and now I'm going to import the bitmap we just downloaded, so this brick round. So now if you double click on it, you can see it's in a bigger form. I want to add a bump to it so it doesn't look so painted on. I just need to add a little bumpiness to the image, so I'm going to go to maps and copy this map to the bump slot. Copy. So now you have a bump to the wall. It doesn't need to be a very strong bump, maybe 40, because it's far away in the image. You will see only a little bit of the bumpiness. Now let's drag this to the fence. As you can see, or can't see, the texture is not visible in the viewport for some reason. So the first thing I want to do in order to see it in the viewport, I'm going to go inside the diffuse slot and hit here, show shaded material in the viewport. Now it changed to brown, but it still doesn't show the texture, and that's because the UVWs are not aligned on this model, on this wall. The UVWs are essentially a way to tell the program how to put the texture on an object. So I'm going to add this modifier in the modifier tab, UVW map, and I'm going to go with box, which means it puts it on the sides like a box, the texture. I'm going to create a square box, 250 over 250 over 250. As you can see, it is aligned pretty well. Let's go back to the camera viewport. Yeah, it looks very good. 250 is a good size. So you can see this orange box here, and this represents how the texture is aligned on an object. So this side is a texture, this side is a texture, this one is a texture, and you can make it bigger to the sides or bigger to this side, so the texture is aligned according to this box. Let's go back. 250, 250, and 250 is good. So now we have our fence, and I want to add a little fence here. Now in reality, in this situation, you had a fence. The fence, this one, was only until here, so it's very close to the building itself. But because we cheated a little bit, the fence moved to this side here. So we need to create something that closes this gap. So I'm going to create a little fence here to close this gap. Let's go to the top and let's create line, a line from here to, hold shift for it to be at 90 degrees, to here and to this direction, like so. Alright, the reason it creates the wall and not just a line like before is because the program remembers the last time you did these changes here, rectangular and the size and everything. So every time you will create a line from now on, it will create it as the first one. If you change parameters and create the next line, it will remember the last parameters. So let's take this wall up here, just a little bit over the grass. Okay, now let's go to the camera. As you can see, just a little bit over the grass, and the true fence is going this direction. Now let's give it the same material as the fence here. So 1, and go to this fence, go to the modify, right click on UVW map, copy and paste the same UVW map that we aligned here. Paste. So now the alignment of the texture is exactly the same. This is good. Alright, so now we have a fence and another fence here. And let's try rendering it. Let's see what the result is. So as you can see, this closes off a little bit of this area, which is good. We have a fence on this side, and that's fine for now. Alright, so now I'm going to hide this plan for a second. The last thing I'm going to do for this tutorial, which is a very big thing, is I'm going to add trees on the sides. So if I go to the camera viewport, I'm going to add trees on this side and trees on this side. Now, in order to get trees, I'm not going to build the trees, because building a tree can take sometimes a week, because the geometry is very, very, very tough. There are a lot of polygons for the branches. It's not like a square form made by humans. It's something that is natural, and that makes it very, very difficult to create, because it's very abstract. So in order to get a tree without building it, I can go to a lot of libraries on the internet. The library I like the most is Evermotion. You can go, just type, it will be in the description below, but you can type it in Google, Evermotion. This site has everything. It has a lot of models of trees and models of books and things for the kitchen renderings and for interior renderings. It has everything, but it is a little bit expensive, and everything here costs money. So in a lot of visualization people use this site for their libraries, but for the purpose of this tutorial I'm not going to use a paid models, because I want it to be free. So I found a couple of trees that you can download for free. I found two sites for this. You have this site where we download the HDRI image. If we go back, this will be in the description. If you go back, you have free trees here, models. But the trees I'm going to use is from a different site, which is called XFrog, and they have a couple of free samples. So we have a couple of free trees. The ones I downloaded is this one and this one. Just add it to the cart, and it's free. So add it to the cart, click your information, and just download these models from here. Okay, so I downloaded these models before, so I can use them. Let's go to the library where I downloaded them from. These two models are these files. It downloads them as zip files. So I want to open these zip files into my library. Again, always open the files you're going to use inside the folder where your max file is. So I'm going to open one tree in this library, and then I'm going to open the other one. Let's go back to downloads, and the other one is this one. And again, open it inside the library, the folder where your max file is. So I'm going to open this one here. So the trees I just downloaded is this one and this one. I'm going to use them for background trees and a couple of trees inside of our perimeter. So one here and one here to close the perspective with like a little leaves here and here. So after I opened, this is the V-Ray real time. After I opened my files into this directory where my max file is, I'm going to go ahead and import the trees. So I'm going to go to import, merge, and go to my directory. Let's take the first tree, models. No, you know what? The second tree looks better, models. So go to the second tree, to Castania setting chestnut. Okay. Go inside models and just pick one. They look almost identical. So I'm going to take randomly the fifth. And I'm going to import this file, this model here. And now I can go to perspective and click on zoom extended selected, and this will zoom in on what I just imported. So this is my tree model. So let's put it somewhere in the scene near the house. Let's put it back here. And this is really where the V-Ray plane starts to play an important role, because the trees don't have ground beneath them, because in our viewport you don't see the ground behind the fence. So the bouncing of the light, if we didn't have the V-Ray plane which goes forever to each direction, the light won't bounce back to the tree. So the tree won't look as good as it can. Just move this here, take this tree up like so, move it a little bit to the side like so, and now I want to see the amount of polygons I have in my scene, because this tree is a lot more heavy on polygons than the entire scene, because you have a lot of polygons. Each leaf is a polygon, and each branch and everything is a polygon, because it's a abstract form. It's a natural form. So now, in order to see how many polygons I have in my scene, I'm going to hit on the plus here. X view, show statistics. Now I can see we have 1,500,000 polygons. If I delete this tree, we have only 39,000. So all the scene is 39,000 polygons. Let's Control Z the tree back. And the tree itself is 1,500,000 by itself. So it's very, very heavy. Once you start getting like to 10 million polygons, even on strong computers, the scene can crash because it's going to be too heavy. In order to surpass this problem, V-Ray created something that is called V-Ray proxy, which means that it will export this tree model to a different file, and then you can replicate this tree how many times you want. You can replicate it 1,000,000 times, and it won't be very, very heavy on the computer. So in order to create this V-Ray proxy thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the tree itself. I'm going to right click and hide unselected. I'm going to hide everything except the tree. Now I'm going to go to group, ungroup. So now I ungrouped this tree. We have 8 objects here. We have the branches, the down branches, the branch in the center, we have the leaves and the fruits. So we have a lot of things here. You know what? I don't need the fruits, because the tree is in the back and it will be very heavy on the software, so I'm just going to delete the fruits. And you have the fruits themselves here, these ones, so I'm going to delete them. Now we have 6 objects left. In order to export this tree as a V-Ray proxy file, you need this to be one editable poly. So what I'm going to, one form, what I'm going to do is just select one of them and hit attach list, and I'm going to attach all the other objects into one object. Shift, select everything, attach, and just hit OK. So now we have one editable mesh, which is our tree. We don't have 6, we have 1. Now let's unhide everything, go back to the camera, and now let's export this as a V-Ray proxy. I'm going to right click on it, V-Ray mesh export, and choose a library where I want to export it. Always export the same as with textures, to a library or to a folder where your max file is, so that when you load the max file, 3D Studio Max won't need to search for the objects or the textures anywhere, because it's inside of its library, inside of its folder. So I'm going to create a new folder inside my folder where my max file is. Let's call this folder V-Ray proxies and hit OK. So now this proxy will be created inside of my max folder in a folder named V-Ray proxies. As you can see, it was created V-Ray proxy folder. Make sure it's on this one and not this one, and make sure that hit escape to cancel autosave. Make sure that automatically create proxies is enabled. Now hit OK and wait a couple of seconds, maybe 10 seconds, depending on your computer. Now this looks weird. This is because this is a representation of the tree. It's not the tree itself. If I hit show whole mesh, it will show everything. But you can make it look like points, which is nothing. You can make it look like a bounding box, which is a box. Preview with faces. It doesn't matter. This is a representation of the tree, because the tree is no longer in the scene. It's in a different file, but it's also inside here. So when you render, you will see the tree as if it's standing in its place. So let's try rendering it. As you can see, the tree is in place, everything is fine, and the tree looks great. But this is only a representation, so it's okay. Now let's show whole mesh for a second. If you go to bounding box, you can see that the polygon count is back to 39,000, which it was before we imported the tree. That's because the polygons of this tree are not calculated. It's outside of this file, so it's much easier on the system. So let's go back to show whole mesh. Now I want to copy this tree a couple of times all over the scene. So if I just shift drag and create a copy, it will need to calculate each tree individually. But if I shift drag and create an instance of this tree, we essentially have only one tree in the scene, which is calculated. So it's very, very easy on the system, on the computer. So you can create as many trees as you want. You can put 1,000,000 trees on a hill using this instance and V-Ray proxy, and the computer won't crash usually. So what I'm going to do is always make sure, shift dragging, not copy, instance. Always make sure when you're working with V-Ray proxies, you instance the trees. Now you have a lot of polygon count here, but after I place the trees in their places, I'm going to go back to bounding box, and then the trees will show only in the rendering time. And in the viewport you will see that there is no polygon increase. So for now I want to see where they're placed. To place it correctly, let's rotate the tree, because I want the trees to look different to each other, just a little bit like so. Take it down so it's not the same height. And make it here. Now select both of them, holding control, shift drag. Always make sure it's an instance, and instance this tree is here. So like so, rotate them. 1 second, on this axis. I don't need 2 trees because you don't see this tree, it's behind the house. I'm going to take this one here. And let's select all 3 trees and just take them a little bit down here. Now I'm going to shift drag them here, instance, very important, and rotate the trees 90 degrees like so. 90 degrees. Go to camera and you can see the trees here. I'm going to take them down a little bit like so, move them to the right like so. Now the third tree is behind the house. Maybe I'll make it taller so we can see just a little bit of a tree down up here. And we need a fence to close this off because I don't want to see the bottom of the trees. And also I want to move them back because we have a road here. So just move them here. This is fine. And now that we have the trees in the back, we have a lot of polygons. Now we can just make it a bounding box. And when you make one bounding box, every one of them becomes a bounding box because we instanced them. We cloned the one tree. So everything you make as a change here will change to every tree. So now we don't have an increase in polygons, which is great. We're going to create a fence here. 1 second. Yeah, let's close this front of the house using a fence. You can create a road here and create more details, but for this example I'm going to just make this fence longer until this point, and I'm going to add another fence in the front here like so. Let's go to the camera and take this fence up and to the right. So we have a closing here. So if we look at the trees as meshes, you can see that the trees are behind something and not in front of something, which is good. Alright, so last thing, let's make this fence the same height as this one. And I'm going to give it the same material as this fence. And I'm going to copy this UVW map and paste it here so that we have a UVW map for this fence. And I don't need to build a ground here for now because we have the V-Ray plane underneath. And you can't really see the ground. I will build it in the next tutorial because you can see it a little bit here. But for now this is fine. And let's try rendering for a second with the trees in the back. Starting to look good. By no means it's finished, but it starts to look much better. You have a foliage in the sides, you have a building with a grass in front, and it starts to look much better. Alright, so let's bring the renderer back. Now we're using V-Ray RT, which is only real-time rendering to assess the lighting if everything is okay. So now I want to go back to production renderer. So I'm going to back to V-Ray Advanced, or which kind of V-Ray do you have. And okay, it's disabled everything we just we created before, so let's just put the settings back. I'm going to give it adaptive. I'm going to give it a value of, let's make it just a little bit higher so we'll render it to look a little bit better. So this one, the minimum subdivision is 2, maximum subdivision 8. This means that there will be a little less noise in the scene. Next thing, a very important one, go to global switches, go to expert, and disable probabilistic lights. This option is a new option to V-Ray 3, and in my experience it doesn't work well. So if you don't disable it, it won't render correctly. So disable this option in expert probabilistic lights. And next thing is, so you have 8 in minimum and maximum subdivision for the adaptive image sampler. Let's go to global DMC, to advanced, and this is fine. Noise threshold, the lower this number, the less noise you will have in the image, but the more time it will render. So for now 0.005 is fine. If you have an older version of V-Ray, which is not 3.2, you will have 0.01 here. So just lower to 0.005. The environment is fine, we don't need to touch it because we have these V-Ray domes as environments. Let's go to color mapping, linear multiplier. We did all this before in previous tutorial, just rehashing this. So linear multiplier, gamma 2.211, clamp output for very bright spots in the image, they will be clamped out, so you won't see them, which is good, because sometimes very burned areas are created, and this fixes this problem. Subpixel mapping on, make sure this one is color mapping only, no gamma. Go to settings and go to expert. Now if you have a Intel processor, a new generation Intel processor, if you bought your computer like 2 years before now, or the computer is newer, this option will work for you. You need to have an Intel processor, and it needs to be relatively new, like 2 years. So use Embrace uses a function inside Intel processors to speed up the rendering. So I'm going to use Embrace, but I'm not going to use it for motion blur because we don't need motion blur here. It's for animations. And hair, we don't need to use this too because we don't have hair in our scene. So only use Embrace. Now this dynamic memory limit is the limit of memory that will be assigned to things like V-Ray proxies. So when we created the proxies for the trees, we need more memory to be assigned for these purposes. So this needs to be something like half of your RAM. So if you have 8 gigabytes of RAM on your system, you need to put 4,000 here. If you have 16 gigabytes, put 8,000 here. This is about correct for most cases. So I have 32 gigabytes, so I'm going to put a lot of RAM here, 16. But you can put as many RAM bits as you need. So if you have only 4 gigabytes of memory, you need to put 2,000 here, not more, because it needs the remaining 2,000 for all the other calculations, like lighting and things like that. This is only for things like V-Ray proxies and displacement of the grass. So because we have proxies and displacement, we need a large value here. But you know what? 8 is fine. So if you have 8 gigabytes, don't put this value over 4 gigabytes. Alright, so the last thing I'm going to do is go to global illumination, which is the bouncing of the light. Go to expert, enable GI, change the brute force to irradiance map, go to the light cache and go to expert. I'm going to up the subdivision of the light cache a little bit to 1300, and this creates a more crisp and better result for the rendering, but takes more time. So 300 rays is fine. I'm going to go to irradiance map and change this to expert, and preset I'm going to put on medium. In 90% of the cases you don't need more than medium. Okay, for these two I want to up the value a little bit. So I usually use a value of 70 or 80, 75 let's say for subdivision. 80 is fine. This is the quality of the irradiance map, of the calculation of the global illumination. So the bigger this value is, the better the rendering will be, but it will take more render time. So you need to keep that in mind. Interpretation samples you don't need to touch unless your final rendering has splotches or weird light leaks in the scene, like light going through the ceiling or the floor, things like that, light leaking inside. We have examples. Let's just Google it. V-Ray light leaks. Have example of this in V-Ray photos. You can see the leaks of light here. Well, I don't know what they mean in this image, but 1 second. Okay, this one is good. You can see that this object is touching the walls, but the light leaks through. You have also like splotches like this here on the walls, things that are strange. Now, when you get these kind of things, you need to up the value of the interpretation samples. But don't up it before you have these problems, because when you up this value, as it says here, it will be more blurred out. So the higher value, the more blurred out the dark areas will be, but you will have less splotches and light leaks. So if you don't have a problem, don't touch this. If you have a problem with light leaks, up this value to maximum 60. So I'm going to make it 30 for now. So 80 and 30. And this is fine for now. I think everything is aligned. Alright, I'm going to make the resolution HD. And I'm going to save this file. Control S to save the file, because we didn't save it from the beginning of the tutorial. And I'm going to render this image out for now. Now, this is by no means the last rendering we're going to do of this on this tutorial series, because we have a lot of other things we want to add, like a little bit of vegetation inside of our grass, and a little bit of ground back here, maybe some trees that are close to the camera that will be up here to close the frame, and things like that. So in the next tutorial, I'm going to finalize this model in 3D Studio Max. I'm going to export this image out, and I'm going to start post-production on this image, which means I'm going to go into Photoshop, and I'm going to create a much more realistic image from what I exported inside 3D Studio Max. So as usual, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.